So this is a book about ideas. The revelation of the communist archives, the secret of the communist archives, is that behind closed doors, they spoke the same way to each other when nobody else was listening as they spoke in their public propaganda. They spoke about class warfare, kulaks, rich peasants, finance capital, bourgeois revolution, socialist revolution. Privately, that's how they spoke. It turns out the secret archives have shown that the communists behind closed doors were communists. That's the big revelation. And that turns out to matter, because if your system is based on the Federalist Papers or your system is based upon Marx and Lenin, you're going to get different outcomes. Not exclusively based upon those things, because many factors are at play here. State-to-state relations, geopolitics, the international system. So Stalin had the idea that small countries that had used to been part of the Russian Empire were not sovereign. They didn't decide their own foreign policy. They were playthings or instruments for the great powers. Poland was independent as a result of the dissolution of the Tsarist Empire. Finland was independent, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but their independence was not real, because they would be used by the British or later by the Nazi Germans to invade the Soviet Union, to overthrow the Soviet system. So what they called the limitrofa, or the near abroad, or the borderlands, were independent countries on the map, but not in Stalin's mind. And so therefore, he sought to prevent those countries from becoming playthings in the hands of the Western powers. So he tried to do coups in those countries to overturn those systems, because that was his way of guaranteeing Soviet security. This is the 1920s already. Now, if you noticed, President Putin, regarding Crimea and Ukraine, said that Ukraine is not a real country, and the Ukrainian army is the foreign legion of NATO. This is the vocabulary out of the 1920s military intelligence files that were on Stalin's desk and that he marked with his blue or red pencil. So that's a big factor. And we can't explain the Stalin phenomenon, we can't explain Russia today without the geopolitics. And then, of course, there was the fact that they were communists, which means that they were not trying to ameliorate the market, ameliorate capitalism, fix it on the edges, redistribute a little bit of income from the upper to the lower. They were not social democrats who accepted capitalism, private property, and the markets. They were communists. They were there to destroy, eradicate, and as Hegel said, transcend capitalism. It was Aufhebung, transcendence of capitalism. And they believe this. It's clear from the internal documents that yes, Stalin was concerned about power. Yes, his personal power was critically important, but not alone. He was a true believer, like Lenin and like the rest of them. Now, the path wasn't always straight to the eradication of capitalism. They had to make concessions along the way. But there was no top Bolshevik ever in the 1920s who comes out and says markets are good, private property is good, capitalism should endure in our system. They fight about how to eradicate it and when to eradicate it, but not about the principle of it. This is very, very important, because we sometimes confuse the communists with the social democrats who, in Germany, for example, who came to accept evolution instead of revolution and came to accept the market and private property. They continued to want to ameliorate the conditions that capitalism caused. But they accepted, eventually, what we would know as the Swedish social democratic model or the European social democratic model. This was not Lenin, and this was not Stalin. They were playing for keeps, and that mattered. But the final point, to answer your question, if after you take into account the geopolitics, and after you take into account the communist ideas, which were real for them, you're still left with the fact that how did he do this? How did he manage to enslave 100 million peasants, collectivize agriculture? How did he manage to eradicate markets and private property? The others in the regime didn't think he could do it, and they thought it would be a catastrophe if he tried. And it was a catastrophe. They were correct. The critics of Stalin, before he launched collectivization, which is where Volume 1 ends, predicted disaster, and their predictions came true. In fact, it was worse than their predictions. But the thing about Stalin that differentiated him from the others, what made Stalin different, was that he did it. He went all the way to the end. Famine, 5 to 7 million dead from starvation, 40 million at least starved but survived, cannibalism. The regime itself was destabilized. His personal dictatorship was destabilized. He kept going until collectivization was 100%, until capitalism had been eradicated in the countryside. And so this is unusual. I don't think there was another person inside the regime sharing Stalin's views on foreign policy, sharing Stalin's views on communism. I don't think somebody else could have done this. And so, in a way, it's never necessary to kill tens of millions of people. It's never necessary. That's a criminal act. And progress doesn't come from murder, especially on the scale that Stalin engaged in. But from the communist point of view, there was no other way to eliminate capitalism, markets, and private property in the countryside. You see, because voluntary collectivization, as of 1928, the year Stalin made his decision, was 1% of the arable land. It was only the peasants who couldn't farm at all who joined the collectives. And they were 16 households, 17 households, on average, 1% of the arable land. There was no voluntary collectivization. There was only coercive collectivization. But if you believe that capitalism is imperialist war, if you believe that capitalism is wage slavery, if you believe that capitalism is injustice and alienation and all the things that they believed in, you try to overcome, transcend Aufhebung of the capitalism. It turned out that the answer was worse than the phenomenon that they were critiquing. Stalinism was worse than the capitalist exploitation. But nonetheless, he was able to pull this off. And that's very unusual. That's his contribution. His contribution was the willpower inside this system to enact this full-scale statization, elimination of markets and private property, which didn't happen in very many places, and nobody thought it was going to happen here, and Stalin, unfortunately, saw it through. So in that sense, his contribution is colossal. He couldn't have done it without the Communist Party. He couldn't have done it without the ideology. He couldn't have done it without the state of siege, so-called capitalist encirclement. He couldn't have done it without millions of young people who wanted to participate in the building of a new world. Many factors played into his ability to do this, but I don't think anybody else in the regime could have managed to go all the way he did.